Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Faculty A, and joining me is Faculty B. Today, we're tackling a really important topic for your GS2 paper on international relations. We're talking about unilateral sanctions and how they really test India's foreign policy. This is something that comes up a lot in the mains, so it's absolutely crucial you get your head around the key ideas. So let's get right into it.
All right, so let's frame our entire discussion around one big question. Are these U.S. sanctions actually a threat to India's strategic autonomy? I mean, really, what's the impact? If you keep this question in the back of your mind, it's going to give you a fantastic framework for structuring your answers. First things first, though, let's understand the challenge we're talking about. Okay, so the challenge. Before we can analyze the threat, we've got to be crystal clear on what these sanctions are. What do they actually mean, and how big of a deal are they really?
Right, and this is where we hit a really key point, a distinction you must make in your answers. Unilateral sanctions, that's when one country just decides to impose them on its own. No UN approval, nothing. That's completely different from multilateral sanctions, which, have the full backing of the UN Security Council. If you can clearly explain this difference, the examiner immediately knows you understand the legal and diplomatic side of things. It's a big plus. Now, just think about this number for a second, 365. That's the number of times the U.S. has imposed sanctions, just in this century alone. It's a huge number, and it tells you one thing very clearly. The United States is, without a doubt, the main sanctioning power in the world. And for a country like India, that reality changes everything. It's the context for all our international relations. That's a really good point, and, to figure out the way forward, we have to look back a bit. We need to understand our history here. So let me bring in Faculty B. How has India typically dealt with this kind of pressure in the past? Well, historically, India has been walking a very, very fine line, a real tightrope act. You see, when the U.S. puts sanctions on countries that are important to us, like Iran or Venezuela, our response, well, it's mostly been to comply, sometimes fully, sometimes partially. And what does that mean? It means we've had to make some pretty tough choices, changing our own policies, often hurting our own interests, just to keep things smooth with Washington. And if you look at this timeline, a clear pattern just jumps out at you. It's a pattern of compliance. Look at the period from 2010 to 2014. See how we cut back on Iranian oil because of U.S. pressure? Sure, we got a little breathing room with the JCPOA deal in 2015, which is when we were able to move forward with the Chabahar Port Agreement. That was a positive. But then look what happens after 2019. Boom. We're forced to stop buying any oil from Iran and Venezuela. We had to zero it out, as they say. So, the big takeaway, the thing you need to remember, is this constant theme. We often end up prioritizing our relationship with the U.S., even when it comes at a direct cost to our own energy security. Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract foreign policy stuff. It has very real consequences. And here's a term you should absolutely use in your answers: opportunity costs. Because think about what we lost, right? We lost access to cheaper, discounted oil from places like Iran and Venezuela. This wasn't just about saving a bit of money on fuel. No, this was a missed opportunity to save billions, to build up our strategic reserves, all of which hits our economy and our energy security right where it hurts. That's absolutely the crucial point, and it brings us right to the heart of the debate, the main argument of this whole explainer. The question is it finally time for India to change its approach? To draw a clear red line and say no more to these kinds of pressure tactics. So let's break it down. Let's look at the two options here. On one hand, if we comply, we hurt our own energy security, we limit our own freedom of action, and frankly, it weakens the whole idea of a rules-based international order that India talks about so much. But on the other hand, defiance. If we choose our battles wisely, it could mean securing discounted oil, strengthening key partnerships, and preserving our independence. Just look at the S-400 deal with Russia. We went ahead with it despite all the pressure from the U.S., and it's a perfect example of how standing firm or strategic defiance can pay off. The former RBI governor, Urjit Patel, had a great way of putting it. He called these sanctions sui generis, which is just a fancy way of saying they're in a category of their own. And, I love this part, he said they have a whack-a-mole nature. It's a brilliant description, right? It just pops up here, then there, with no rhyme or reason. And coming from a top economist, that tells you just how unpredictable and chaotic these measures are. How can any country plan for the long term with that kind of uncertainty? And we can look to our own history for guidance here. Think back to 1966. The U.S. was trying to use food aid to pressure us politically. But what did Prime Minister Indira Gandhi do? She didn't comply. Instead, she made a promise to end our ship-to-mouth existence, our dependency on others for food. And what came out of that?
the Green Revolution. It's such a powerful parallel for today. The argument is, just like we fought for food security back then, we need to fight for our energy security now, with that same determination, to guarantee our strategic independence.
That's such a powerful lesson from our history. It really is key. So let's take that spirit and apply it to today. Faculty B, what are the actual practical steps India can take? What are the policy options on the table to build up this kind of resilience? Right, so the way forward seems to be a strategy with several different parts. First, we need to build our own payment mechanisms. Think of things like the rupee rial system with Iran. The goal is to not be so dependent on the US dollar for everything. Second, work more closely with groups like BRICS to create our own settlement arrangements. Third, and this is a bit more technical, use air-gapped financial institutions, basically banks that are walled off from Western pressure. And finally, the big one, the long-term fix, go all in on renewable energy. The less we depend on imported fossil fuels, the less leverage anyone has over us. These are the kind of solid, concrete policy points that will make your mains answer stand out. Those are excellent, concrete points. So now let's pull all of this together. Let's think about how you can take everything we've discussed and use it directly in the exam hall, not just for the mains, but for your interview as well. Okay, so let's look at some potential mains questions. If you get a question like the first one about strategic autonomy, here's your structure. Start by defining unilateral sanctions, then walk through India's history of compliance. Next, talk about the opportunity costs. And finally, make the argument for drawing a red line. It's a logical flow. Now, if the question is more about policy options, like the second one, you just lay out those 4 steps we just talked about: payment systems, BRICS, air-gapped institutions, and renewables. See, the framework we've built here gives you a really strong base to answer either type of question. And for the interview, Faculty B, what's a final piece of advice you'd give our aspirants on this? Indeed. In your personality test, they're very likely to ask you about this balancing act. How do we manage our very important relationship with the US while also protecting our strategic autonomy? And remember, there's no single correct answer here. What they're looking for is your thought process, your ability to think through a complex issue. So a good, nuanced answer would start by saying, yes, the US partnership is incredibly valuable, but you have to follow that up by firmly stating that India's core national interests and our absolute right to make our own foreign policy decisions, well, those are non-negotiable. It's really the central challenge of Indian diplomacy today, a critical balancing act. We really hope this discussion has helped clarify things for you. All the very best with your preparation.